It is a great pleasure to meet today Professor Nicolas Rouleau. He's a behavioral neuroscientist and a bioengineer and assistant professor in Ontario, Canada at the Algoma University. Welcome, Nicolas.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure. So I'm going to ask you one question, but it may take you the whole interview to unpack it. The first question is, do you have a good working definition of consciousness? And then it would be nice to talk about the two prevalent model of consciousness. The standard model is what we call the production model, when the brain produces consciousness with synaptic firing and spikes. And we have Christophe Koch, Mark Humphreys that stick by this theory. So it'd be nice to know what is explained by this theory and what are its limits. Are the synapses too slow to really create consciousness, etc.? The other theory, and Nicolas was telling me, maybe only 5% of the neuroscientists are following it, but it's a new but growing approach. It's a transmission model, as suggested by William James. He talked about those different models. It would be like the brain has antennas and receive consciousness, and we could explain where this consciousness is located. William James talked about infinite thoughts, but we talk now more about electromagnetic fields. And so the brain doesn't compute consciousness, but the brain receives consciousness through this electromagnetic field. So now what we like to know is how much data do we have in that for this model, and what are its limits? That's a very long question.
Yes, but I think you've done most of my work for me, and by explaining it. But yeah, I'll start with the first, which is, do I have a working definition of consciousness? And as anyone in this field is aware, there are countless definitions of consciousness that have been floated, and it's very difficult to get everyone on the same page in terms of pinning it down to a single definition. The definition that I typically use when pointing directly to consciousness is that of subjective experience. So I don't think it's necessarily just attention or awareness or self-awareness, as some suggest, but rather subjective experience. It is the qualitative component of brain activity. There are many quantitative components of brain activity. We can look at neurotransmission, and we could look at the electromagnetic fields that are generated by the brain, and certain biomolecular pathways. But then the qualitative component, which can't be measured directly, at least not yet, by current instrumentation, is in the domain of what we're referring to with consciousness. So consciousness, to summarize, I would say, is the subjective component of brain activity. And to get to the second part of your question, which is
Nicolas. So now we have something quite rare in science. We have the word subjectivity to describe something, and now we are going to talk about how can we can reproduce something like this. I mean, it's by its definition already, we can see tons of problem coming for the scientific experiment.
Which is exactly why I tend to, for practical reasons, only focus on neural correlates of consciousness. So I tend to limit my study of consciousness to anything that's measurable at the level of the brain that seems to correlate with consciousness in a quantitative sense. When we're talking about human brains, this is usually fMRI data, EEG data, subjective self-report, so behavioral correlates and things like this. These are correlates of conscious experience, and I'm measuring those specifically, not the consciousness itself, which is the sort of implicit measure in this case.
So if we skip a little bit to the first part, the brain, the consciousness is generated by the brain. Where are we today with the neural correlate of consciousness? You used to talk about, cortex, you used to talk about, the brainstem, the insula. Do we have a clear idea what could be the correlate of consciousness, or just synaptic activity without a specific structure?
Yeah, sure. The standard model for the neurobiological explanation or mechanism of consciousness centers around several brain structures that none can be described necessarily as sufficient, but many of them are described as necessary.
Okay.
And we could name a number of them. One of them is the cerebral cortex. There's no doubt that the cortex is involved with conscious experience, but in conjunction with the thalamus, of course, because you need to actually have inputs to the cortex, and those will largely come from other cortical regions as well as thalamic nuclei. So thalamocortical circuits seem to be a major component of the neurobiological explanation for consciousness. And that's absolutely part of it. But there are other regions as well, deeper brainstem regions, reticular activating systems, for example, that are just as valid as the cortex in terms of describing them as necessary conditions for consciousness. Because, of course, if you sever some of these brainstem nuclei, like the periaqueductal gray, for example, if you cause a lesion in this region, you will get a kind of coma-like state. And so you will remove consciousness, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the seat of consciousness is the periaqueductal gray. And no one really thinks that that is the sufficient brain region to generate consciousness. So even though you can damage certain areas and completely remove consciousness, or at least suppress it for some extended period of time, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the generator of consciousness. And the brain is very much like that. In neuroscience, and this is why I take a tissue engineering approach in my own research. When we study the brains of animals and humans, we're dealing with brain regions that are morphogenetically constrained. They've been hooked up in a very specific way given our evolutionary history. So, for example, there are just going to be connections between the thalamus and the cortex, and these are going to be very specific. Like there's going to be specific nuclei sending to specific cortical regions, and it's not like you can go in and rearrange them. But with tissue engineering and other kinds of techniques that are starting to emerge, you can actually create customizable brains and try to understand brain processes in this way. But we're always going to be stuck if we're just studying animals and humans. We're always going to be stuck with the issue of dealing with correlates rather than causes, because it's fundamentally impossible to disentangle all of these variables because they can't be controlled systematically. It's just not a tractable system.
So most of the studies are done in animal. I mean, we destroy some part of the thalamus, the reticular alarm system for sure, the brainstem. How many regions do you have like that? Maybe I have 4 or 5. Do you have more than which region, if destroyed, will bring you into a coma? There's more than 5?
Well,
much of them. Huh?
Well, I would say that there's probably many dozens, perhaps hundreds of regions, because we think of the cortex as being a single structure, but in fact, the histology reveals that it's actually many dozens of regions that are distinct cytologically, right? So the cytoarchitecture of the cortex, as defined by Brodmann areas, for example, we're talking about, right, exactly. We're talking about a really large number compared to just describing it as the cortex. So
not all of these regions will bring you into coma.
No, but certainly many of those regions would independently remove components of consciousness, right? Like, because if in fact you adopt the definition that I'm adopting, which is conscious experience, the conscious experience of someone who has no vision, or no hearing, or perhaps no bodily self-awareness, that would be quite different than someone who did have those. So I would say that
you modify your conscious perception. Yeah. Right. So that's the standard model. So what are the pros and cons? What are the limits of the standard model? The brain generate consciousness. So usually synaptic activity, right? That's what's most accepted. Yeah.
Yeah, we could talk about this at several levels. If we talk about it at some of the most microscopic levels, we could say, yes, the neurobiological model or the productive model of consciousness suggests that conscious experience is effectively an emergent property of brain function being the electrochemical signaling at the level of synapses, gap junctions, ephaptic couplings between cells and within specific cell microenvironments. So yes, it's all operating at the level of cells. And even though we will be talking about transmissive consciousness later, I actually don't think that the productive model is in any way in error in a kind of mutually exclusive way. So like the productive model works and it has predictive validity. And when we look at it, the cells really are signaling to each other, and they really are associated with types of conscious experience. But I think that there's a parallel process that's occurring that explains more of what we see at the macro levels in terms of experience.
So we could say a radio and its antenna, right? You destroy the radio, obviously you don't receive your music, but there's no antenna, there's no way to receive. You also don't receive the music. So there's a physical correlate, and so it doesn't exclude each other for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
yeah, and certainly if you removed, you could physically cut the antenna off of a radio, a little portable radio, and you could still inject current into that radio, or you could have the radio play music from in another way if you were able to get the information in a way that didn't involve transmission of electromagnetic waves. So all of the circuitry would still be completely valid and important, and obviously necessary to the function of the whole system.
Yeah. And so, okay. And so if you want to go into your specialty, the radio as an antenna.
Yeah, so I think there's mounting evidence at this point that the brain does have transmissive capacities. And what I mean by that is there are ways that brains, and specifically brain cells, will signal to each other in ways that aren't explained by simple biomolecular pathways or electrotonic coupling by gap junctions. There are basically wireless mechanisms for cells to interact with each other. The most the mechanism, yeah, the mechanism that has the most fleshed out neurobiological mechanism would be the ephaptic couplings. Ephaptic couplings are electric field, the generation and reception of electric fields at the level of cells. Basically, you can move currents into and out of cells by generating electromagnetic fields around them. And all it really takes for a cell to fire an action potential is for its membrane to become depolarized sufficiently. And you can do that by moving currents. So you can accomplish this completely wirelessly without having the neurons actually touch each other. And so we know neurons.
Ephaptic coupling as opposed to synaptic coupling. And that's ephapsis means to touch in Greece. So it's just an transmission wirelessly through the expansion of the field, which means it's a much wider transmission. But what I'm not clear is, I thought the myelin stop, these kind of myelin sheath are going to stop some of this transmission, correct? So it's still not pervading everywhere in the brain.
Not necessarily, because myelin will have insulating and wire-like properties that will mimic the types of Faraday induction that you see at the macroscopic level. That you might actually run this type of experiment in a physics lab, for example. So the individual axons, even though they're myelinated, they can sense the electric fields of neighboring cells. And even if they couldn't, there are spaces between the myelin,
between
the nodes of
Ranvier, yeah. Okay,
exactly.
So between is sheath, you have a space, and you can receive transmission there. Perfect.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's a wireless transmission, but can it be a transmission created by a synapse previously, or it could?
Yeah, absolutely. You can actually. So this is why they're actually they work together quite nicely, because in the process of synaptic transmission, what will happen ultimately is that you'll induce some sort of internal current in the cell, and that current will be associated with the movement of charged particles. The movement of charged particles will give rise to a magnetic field as well as an electric field, and those will permeate the space between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, and will actually induce effects in a way that isn't explained by the simple synapse, by chemical transmission, but rather by this electromagnetic transmission.
First tricky question. So we know that white light can go through the cranium, and that's why we have biophotonic activity. Do we know how far those fields are going? Which means, can I read your field? Can I perceive your field? Can you modify my field? I remember.
Yeah, certainly. So, and I'd love to talk more about light as well, because it turns out that in the last few years, we've also shown in the field of biophotonics that there are biophoton emissions specifically from the nodes of Ranvier, which is very interesting. And in fact, some authors have suggested that the nodes of Ranvier along the axon act as a kind of photonic transmitter. So there's...
But the node of Ranvier is just a piece of axon. So the whole axon is doing it.
The whole axon is doing it, but at regularly spaced intervals.
Oh, also. So just to node of Ranvier, it's the name of someone. And so you remember you have axon. When they're myelinated, you have a big sheath, an axon. Then you have a little space and another sheath of myelin, a little space, another sheath of myelin. So you have this space between those sheath of myelin, and those are the node of Ranvier when the axon is exposed. So we talked before about receiving electromagnetic field, and now you talk about emitting biophoton from there.
Yes, and for those who aren't aware, I mean, electromagnetic fields and photons are effectively the same thing. I mean, they're both products of the electromagnetic force. They're simply just different manifestations of the same force. So they're fundamentally electromagnetic. And yes, the node of Ranvier is not just a space, it's also a hyper-concentrated localization of voltage-gated channels. So these are ion channels that are opening spontaneously when an action potential runs along the axon as a kind of electromagnetic vortex. And that space is specifically emitting biophotons at a higher rate than the myelinated portions of the axon as well. So there seems to be an interesting biophotonic relationship there as well.
Yeah, I didn't know that. So you have probably more concentration of potassium and sodium there, just at this, so you have more exchange happening. And
yes, absolutely. That is where the ionic flux is concentrating, is at the node.
Yeah, you wonder why you had node before when this insulation is not all along. So now it makes sense. And you have a rhythm there, especially you have a space. Is the space the same in every type of nerve?
Well, so that's a very interesting question, and it's not specifically my area, but I have looked into this because I had the same idea, which was, are these spaces regular? Are they irregular? And what would that mean for biophoton emission? And it turns out that when you look at the myelin sheath along an axon and you basically image it, and then you run it through a statistical processor that shows you the periodicity of myelin sheath, the periodicity is highly regular. So it's very sinusoidal in terms of its deposition. It's not perfectly regular, almost nothing in biology is, but it's very highly regularized. And so, yes, there is a kind of regular pattern of biophoton emission. And if the action potential is associated with these biophoton emissions, you can imagine a sequence of pulses occurring along the entire axon.
You think
that would be, yeah.
We could correlate that to a crystalline structure, a crystal, biocrystal?
In a sense, I mean, it has a kind of regular pattern. So I think it has a similar structure, yes.
A crystal emitting light.
Perhaps. I mean, we know that axons. Well, we know that axons have fiber optic-like properties as well. So if you actually shine light through the axon, it does tend to act like a waveguide. And so there are properties that are almost material that haven't been thoroughly investigated about neurons and other cells as well that seem to act as transmitters for light communication in the brain.
So all this, we could still explain it by the brain as producing consciousness. What was the limit of this model that you have to bring up a much wider model scientifically?
Well, for a long time in the history of psychology and neuroscience, there have been phenomena that have been largely marginalized by scientists, mostly because the productive model has been fully dominant for over 100 years, even from the time of William James, which was over 100 years now. We had basically unanimity in terms of subscription to the productive model. In some of his speeches, he actually says that there are effectively no neurophysiologists who consider transmission to be a viable mechanism for brain activity. And that's still true today. There's basically no one looking at this. I say that, but of course there is a small group of people who are interested in this, and there is a kind of revival. But yeah, it died off for many years, and it's only seeing a resurgence just now.
So the limit of the model, I mean, could you say that, well, we see spikes, how do we explain consciousness? Or there's not enough synaptic activity to create, I mean, what are really the limits that's going to make this model collapse eventually?
Yeah, so I should have addressed that in the previous question, but yes, the limits include things like, well, people have reported experiences for a very long time that have involved what seem to be connections between people's brains. Even the inventor of EEG, Hans Berger, only invented that device after having what is termed now to be a psi experience, which is he had what was described as a spontaneous moment of telekinesis between he and his sister, where he was in life-threatening danger, and his sister had this emotional response to what she didn't know what was happening hundreds of miles away, but she wrote a telegram that was time-stamped, and it was eventually found out that she had this sort of emotional response when he was basically having a near-death experience. And after figuring this out, he decided to look for a means by which brains could potentially interact with each other in a kind of non-local way. And in the process of doing that, found EEG, which is voltage fluctuations over the surface of the scalp, which for 100 years, people would, scientists in the field might say, is completely irrelevant with respect to spontaneous telekinesis. Like, what is the connection? That's basically an accidental finding. But I would say that, in fact, if there is an electromagnetic basis to transmission of thought, both internally and externally, then perhaps Hans Berger did find what he was looking for, which was a signal that could potentially link brains.
So field that communicate within the brain, intra and inter between brains, right? And those are the field created by the brain, the field created by the planet, the Schumann resonance, the field created by, so we are surrounded by, well, I'm talking about the natural field right now. So what field do we know?
Well, the most pervasive field on the planet would be the Schumann resonance, as you say, which is the Earth has an electromagnetic field generated by molten iron within its core, but it has an intrinsic oscillation to it, which is generated largely by lightning, global lightning. And the mode frequency of the Schumann resonance is approximately 7.8 hertz. And that frequency, as it turns out, is the primary frequency that is affected in the brain when we shield the brain using copper, Faraday cages, mu metal. When you shield the brain from electromagnetic activity in the environment, typically the band range that you affect when measuring EEG is in the theta to alpha range. And so that's consistent with Schumann resonance. But there are other things that seem to point to Schumann resonance being important as well, such as the intrinsic resonance frequency of brain matter based upon its capacitance. So when you look at brain tissue itself, there is an intrinsic resonance frequency of approximately 7 hertz. And you can also find a similar resonance frequency by taking the bulk velocity of action potentials and the circumference of the brain. And you can find that it's in the range of about 7 to 10 hertz as well. So we're talking about a pretty narrow set of frequency bands that are potentially going to allow the brain to resonate with electromagnetic fields in the environment, as well as internal magnetic fields.
Perfect. So just to remember, hertz is 1 per second. So 7 hertz is 7 times per second. So it's difficult to perceive. It's very fast, 7 times per second. Schumann, 7.83. The theta is more or less 5 per second. Alpha is 10 per second. So between theta and alpha. Do you remember? Did you learn about Yenas and his in New York thalamocortical oscillation from the central medial nucleus of the thalamus going back and forth to the cortex? I think it's 10 to 20 hertz, something like that. That's electromagnetic also.
Well, there's a couple things going on there, which is, I would say that the action potential is by definition electromagnetic, because it is the movement of charge, and it has a vector as well, like it moves in a particular direction, and it is ultimately an electromagnetic vortex. So even the productive model is going to be linked to the electromagnetic field. But in addition to that, yes, there's going to be the firing of multiple cells simultaneously, and there's reciprocal connections between these two areas. And because we have the generation of these action potentials that are firing together, you do get these bulk electromagnetic fields that are generated. And this isn't a novel discovery, because we've had technologies like magnetoencephalography for several decades now, which have allowed clinicians and scientists to measure magnetic fields outside of the brain using squids. That's right.
Quantitative squid semi-conductive quantum interference device, something like that. So it's a magnetometer. You measure the magnetic field. Yeah. And we know that the largest field in the body, I think it's almost 10 times more than the heart. The brain is the heart. So you must have a huge interaction between those two structures, the two main fields in the body.
That wouldn't surprise me at all, for several reasons. I mean, we know that we can measure the electromagnetic field of the heart several feet out from the heart. So the brain is not that far away from the heart in the vertical axis. So I can't imagine that there's a particular direction that the heart is emitting. But yeah, I would say that there certainly is going to be overlap. And I wonder if there are evidences from surgeries involving severing the vagal nerve from the connections via the vagal nerve between the brain and the heart that show synchronization despite any kind of physical connection between the two areas.
They already show, that the heart sends more message to the brain than the brain send to the heart to try to control the heart through the vagus nerve. The heart is sending more message to the brain than the brain. We assume the brain is controlling the heart, but it doesn't go so much in that direction. Well, that's fascinating, really. So, okay, so we have this electromagnetic field outside and inside, and there's no option. To make electromagnetic field diffuse everywhere, 360, and then interact with each other. We know that some field creates some physiological response, besides even the synapse, right? So what do we know about that? Just the electromagnetic field can create, in live humans, can stimulate different physiological processes, right?
Absolutely. One of the most well-known, one of the most well-characterized physiological responses is the ordering of cytoskeleton. So if you have tubulin molecules which make up the skeleton of the cell, the cytoskeleton of the cell, which gives it shape. These proteins can assemble and align within electric fields very readily, and that would interfere with all sorts of processes or potentially enhance processes in the brain, such as synaptogenesis, because of course, in order to get synapses and in order to form memories and to have a plastic brain, you actually need to change the shape and form new connections between cells and generate synaptic spines and things like this, which require the movement of the cytoskeleton. So yes, of course, the electromagnetic fields can influence individual proteins at that level. We also know that they can activate particular ion channels. There are ion channels that are sensitive to these things. We also know that certain tissues that contain concentrations of, for example, magnetite, which is a biogenic metal that exists within certain areas of the brain, including the hippocampus. And these areas and these particles are sensitive to magnetic fields as well.
Yeah, and we know that in a few animals, especially I remember the flying the pigeon, right? They find their north through the magnetite in their hippocampus.
That's right, exactly. And some are associated with some of them have embedded magnetite within their nasal morphologies as well. So there's potentially a link between some of these older olfactory structures and magnetite. And incidentally, the hippocampus is directly adjacent to the entorhinal cortex, which is the main area in the brain associated with smell. So it probably has an old link with some of these more primitive sensory functions.
So now consciousness, we receive consciousness. So my consciousness, my personal consciousness, do you have any idea where it's encoded? Do we talk about 0-point field? I mean, where is your consciousness right now?
I mean,
we don't know. That's beyond scientific exploration.
Yeah, that is the frontier right now. The question is, where is it stored, and so on. It seems to be contained within our heads. There's no doubt that it's at least momentarily or transiently expressed at the level of the brain, if in fact transmissive consciousness is a sort of viable mechanism. But where is it when it's not there? It's difficult to say. You can get these sort of holographic-like properties in magnetic fields where several points can be simultaneously representing the same thing. So you can have information storage over large spaces. So that there's a lot of potential for this, but that is the frontier right now, is trying to determine where, in fact, this can be represented other than a brain.
So what about 0-point field? It's not a good working, the 0-point field is not a good working theory for that?
I'm not super familiar with it, but I have heard of it, and I've read a little bit about it, and it does seem to fit the criteria in terms of the ability to have the representation of consciousness in multiple places simultaneously.
All right, so let's talk about what we know of biology. There's many organisms without central nervous system that have consciousness, that react, avoid obstacles, and react to different stimuli. So we cannot set consciousness in the brain. I mean, we can have response without central nervous system, right?
I would say that in the field of neuroscience, most neuroscientists would say that consciousness is not possible without a brain. And yet, as you say, there are many organisms that don't have brains at all. Perhaps they don't even have neurons. And these organisms can navigate mazes, solve problems, make decisions. They display all of the operational mechanisms of learning, even perhaps the biological pathways involved with learning. And yet, yes, they don't have brains at all. So one of the examples of this is Physarum polycephalum, which is the yellow slime mold. This is a mold that can very efficiently rearrange its body, and it uses its body as a kind of computational substrate to solve problems, solve mazes, link circuits, and do all sorts of interesting work without any neurons. And there are other organisms like this. But in fact, even at the level of single cells, like paramecia, we see the basic functions that are involved with some of the most primitive forms of cognition or minimal cognition, such as learning. Habituation, for example, which was studied for and is still studied in the field of psychology, can be displayed at the level of individual cells. If you repeatedly stimulate cells, they will enable a mechanism internally that will reduce their sensitivity to that stimulus, and thus their response will show decrements that are proportional to the stimulus. And then after a period of time, that initial response will return to normal, which shows all the basic operations of habituation. It's just that people who study animals feel very uncomfortable calling that habituation, because it gives a lot of credit to individual cells, what was once only afforded to organisms, very complex beings.
So they are shy. They don't call that consciousness.
No, well, they don't even call it cognition or learning.
Okay.
They'll simply say that it's adaptation, or that it's a reflex or something like this. There is a very serious bias against simple systems, even though we are absolutely made of simple systems. The brain is made of cells that can be understood very explicitly and in very high detail. We understand a lot about brain cells, and yet we don't understand some of these higher order functions that we will soon understand.
Good. So I know you work with Michael Persinger for almost 10 years or something like this. So he mentioned Akashic records and things like that, right? So where could we have memories? Like, they could be somewhere, like the Akashic, it could be an electromagnetic wave. You have enough, capacitance to receive the memory of human beings and all the human beings. I mean, what can you
Right.
talk about that? Yeah.
Well, the metaphor of the Akashic record, which has its roots in theology and Hinduism, and then later in the occult, really is a kind of metaphor for what we think is happening now. And what we think is happening now is completely physical. It's not like it's metaphysical or anything. It's something that has physical basis in the laws of nature, and it's just a matter of figuring out how that actually works. And one of the ways that it could work is you could have a pervasive field that contains the information, and that information is transmitted to individual receivers. So that's one way that you could manifest this organization. But another way would be that the information is stored locally within across receivers and emitters in the form of brains and other bodies. And then that information is shared within certain kinds of local fields. And there may be intermediate fields that actually move information across these separate, these sort of quasi-independent spaces. But all of this is conjecture unless we can actually show it experimentally. So I'm really interested in actually doing the experiments to show how this could actually happen.
So in the second model, if all the brain dies, there's no more memory. It's like an iCloud. In the first model, the field is everywhere, and the field doesn't include, you don't necessarily need the central nervous system to keep the memory in place. In the first model, it would mean that the first atom of hydrogen created, helium, and later on the photons, will keep some type of memory, or will create some memory in the electromagnetic field, which means if you take I know you work on dead tissues, if you take some of the dead tissues, all the molecule in those tissues kept memories of the individual person, maybe their family lineage, and maybe from the Big Bang, whatever the Big Bang or was, you can keep memories, or I have access to this type of memory from the field.
Right. And several hours after the brain dies, you already have massive degradation of the connections that store the patterns that are effectively our memories and our personality and so on. And so the processes of death will erase that information just by dint of the fact that cells are degrading and no longer being connected in this way. If you preserve the brain shortly after death, yes, you can preserve those connections, and therefore it stands to reason that you preserve that information. It just simply can't be expressed or read, at least not yet. We don't have the technology to go in and scan brain slices and actually extract personal subjective experience type information and then relay it somewhere else. If we could, we would have effectively a technology to live forever, because you could just simply transfer that information to another vessel. But we can't do that, at least not yet. So the question is, does the brain have any kind of external storage that would exist after death? And one of the means by which this could occur is through biophotons. It's not completely fleshed out, but if biophotons are in fact going to be associated with action potentials and they are emitted from the brain, then thoughts, which are really it's just a word we use for lots of processing of brain activity in the form of action potentials throughout this approximately 1 kilogram of water and protein and fat between our ears. If those photons are emitted every time we have a thought, then they do exist. They exist outside of us. And you can imagine photons coming off of the head, going off into space. They exist somewhere. And if you could reconstitute them, if you could bring them back somehow or read them, the totality of your photonic field that you emit over a lifetime, you could reconstitute the information, but it's highly impractical because you're going to lose a lot of information. Of course, how do you actually convert the light into thoughts? This is all very sci-fi. So I think what's happening is, if in fact there is an external storage of information outside of the brain in the form of electromagnetic energy, it's probably interacting with our local environment, which is the Earth's magnetic field. And if it isn't occurring at that level, I'm not sure what other kind of storage space there is for this type of field. It could be something like a 0-point field. It could be another mechanism entirely that hasn't yet been fleshed out. But I think it has something to do with our local electromagnetic environment, because we know that the local electromagnetic environment does seem to, its fluctuations correlate with all sorts of interesting phenomena, like very strange dreams, prophetic dreams that end up containing information that lead to actual, or rather precede actual events. And these are recorded, published studies that show that when you have a geomagnetic storm or the absence of a storm, you can have certain kinds of dreamlike effects. So there's all sorts of interesting things happening between the geomagnetic field and our brains that seem to suggest a link. And if that link includes memory, well, that's an interesting path for this kind of research.
But somehow I can understand, electromagnetic oscillation, creating memories. Where would you store memory on a photon?
Well, you can store, there are several ways to store information in photons. They include spin, they include frequency, and phase, or you could have a kind of bulk phase and individual phase. So that there are ways to actually store information in photons and packets of photons, but how that actually interacts with the brain, this is completely new. No one's really explored this in great detail yet. So we not me personally, but the physics is understood in terms of how to store information in light. And then there is a field, a burgeoning field, so some would say a re-emerging field of biophotonics at the level of the brain. But they just need to come together, and it's very difficult to bring them together because there's resistance from both sides to communicate. But I believe the information, or rather the answers, will come soon.
With biophotons, it's amazing. Yeah. so Pop started to talk about biophoton like this. He was working already on brain and memory already at the origin of the theory of biophotons.
Yeah, the brain was involved pretty early on. Not with the initial experiments, which go back about 100 years with the original Gurwitch experiments, but yes, with Pop and the more contemporary researchers in this field, the brain has been fairly central to an understanding of biophotons, and that could have to do with a lot of things. It's not necessarily because the brain is special, although it in fact might be, but it seems to be because brains are very energetic organs, and they seem to have a lot of reactive oxygen species generation because of the metabolism that's involved with brain activity. And so brains are really bright emitters of light, of biophotons. And interestingly enough, some of the work by Jai-Pei Dai shows that there's blue shifts and red shifts associated with different kinds of cognitive processes. So intelligence, for example, across species tends to be correlated with red shifted light in biophoton emissions from the brain. Brain aging tends to be correlated with blue shifted photons. So as you get older, you have this shift in wavelength of the light itself. So there's all sorts of interesting brain phenomena that have been explored with biophoton research, but biophoton research extends outside of the brain as well. There's lots of study of different organ systems and non-human tissues as well.
That's what I was trying to think. Like now we're talking about every cells emitting biophotons, every DNA, the DNA emits biophotons. So now we can just say the brain emits a bit more or more intensely, but we're talking about full body expression of biophotons. Those biophotons, basically they leave your body, and until they meet matter again, they can almost immortal. They just continue for almost forever. We're not sure if they have a weight, a mass or not. So they're still working on that. So it will be, but then, I mean, you have to create a memory, you have to create a sequence of something with those biophotons. You have not just one. So sequence maybe hold in the field somewhere, and maybe 0-point field or maybe magnetic field. But what happens if I mean, those fields are they located only around Earth? If something happened to Earth, this memory is erased, or is going through the whole cosmos? I mean, that's a fantastic hypothesis there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Difficult to say until we get a lab outside of not only the Earth, but outside of the solar system. And that should be quite a while.
We're going to go on Sirius and see if we can cap some of those fields from the Earth. That'd be amazing.
I need the Sirius fields. Yes.
So did you work directly with the God helmet with Michael Persinger?
Yeah, I worked with the next generation of God helmets. So there was the original, which was very highly publicized and celebrated, and then we had several subsequent versions that involved solenoids over the temporal lobes, but were slightly different. And
so you were using what frequency you were using to stimulate the temporal lobes?
Well, the main so they're not sine waves. So that's the critical thing, is that they don't just have one frequency. They're not square waves or sawtooth waves or anything like that. They're highly complex, and they're based upon the activity of brain regions. So they're custom fields that have very complex frequency modulations that are derived from areas like the amygdala. So like burst firing in the amygdala was the inspiration for one of the fields that's used. And then there are other kinds of inspirations for other fields as well.
But you mean multiple field targeting multiple region simultaneously, or different?
Usually in sequence, usually one after the other.
So you just to remember, a lot of mystical experience, a lot of guru today, scientists say, well, it's just a temporal lobe epilepsy. So they think that those are created, they are not real. But, and we have the Geschwin syndrome that in medicine, when we have a temporal lobe epilepsy, people have a hyper religiosity, they have they talk a lot, they have a intensified mental activity, irritability sometimes. And they think that temporal lobe is one of the areas when you can create a lot of mystical experience. And you try to stimulate it with solenoid magnetic field to recreate those experiences. And you had a great success, right?
Yeah, there was great success in doing this over 30 years of experiments. And basically the stereotypical phenomenon is that someone sits alone in a room, basically in the dark, and they have the field being generated over their temporal lobes for several minutes. And what you have is after about 15 to 20 minutes, you start to get the experience of basically the sensed presence. So you have the sense that someone is in the room with you. And some people will attribute that person in the room with them, which is a product of their brain activity. They'll attribute the identity of the person in the room to a deceased loved one, but sometimes they'll attribute it to a deity. And it's usually culturally correlated. So if you're a Catholic, you'll say that it's Mary. If you're a Muslim, you'll say that it's Muhammad, and so on. And there seems to be this overwhelming feeling of joy or contentedness with having that person around you. And so this treatment, or rather this experience, has been used as a kind of way of in addition to demonstrating the interesting properties of the temporal lobe, as you say, and its relationship with syndromes like Geschwin syndrome. It has also been used as a way to as a therapy for people who are grieving and for people who are experiencing loss. So yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon, but what we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years is a few replications of it in other labs. But what we now need to see in terms of like the next steps would be developing this further. What kinds of other experiences can we generate with electromagnetic fields? Is it just limited to the temporal lobes? Because we know the temporal lobes are particularly sensitive, but can we activate other areas of the brain? And can we use this kind of technology to enhance cognition? Can we use it to treat certain kinds of underlying disorders in the way that currently technologies like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is much more intense, about 1 million times more intense in terms of the field strength? Can we use these technologies to treat people with depression, anxiety, and so on?
So it's a very pleasant experience, right?
It can be. It can also induce. There's different kinds of reported experiences. They're not all the same. They're thematically similar in the way that I just described, but some people will experience apprehension. Some people are uncomfortable with it. But there are people who will experience pleasure, a kind of inner peace, things like this. So there's a range of experience, but there is a kind of average typical experience, which is the one I described.
I assume, rewards, I assume you're going to stimulate the dopamine circuitry and maybe serotonin and things like that. After doing a lot of sessions, do you feel like this experience, you have less and less of those experiences, they're less and less magnificent, or it's you lose a little bit the power of those God helmet, or not?
There seems to be the potential for repeated experiences. Like not a lot of the research was involved repeated measures of the same people over and over, but where there were repeated measures, people were able to have the experience multiple times. So it wasn't a sort of one and done phenomenon. people could have the experience multiple times, which is consistent with the naturalistic version of that type of experience. There are people who will report being visited by angels or deities in places of worship or in their own homes multiple times, not just once.
Right. And so the general public cannot buy that yet.
No, there's no commercial version of it, but the devices are, sorry?
Do you think it would be dangerous because you need some supervision for that? Because I can see it for, addiction. I can see it for, stopping, something. I mean, it should be an amazing experience for the people who have a positive experience with it.
I think that it should probably not just be given free of any kind of constraint, because of course, if there is the potential to alter brain activity, then that alteration may not always be favorable. And of course, there are people who are susceptible to having basically adverse reactions to certain kinds of drugs, but also electromagnetic fields. And you could make the argument that there will be individuals who you might say for these individuals that electromagnetic field exposures would be contraindicated.
Right.
So for example, if we look at people with psychotic disorders,
right,
we know that people with psychotic disorders, usually LSD and other kinds of hallucinogens are contraindicated for these people. And that's largely associated with activation of serotonergic pathways. And many of the serotonin pathways that we have and the primary locus for the experience of LSD, the experience associated with hallucinogens like LSD, serotonergic drugs, is primarily localized within the temporal lobes. So if we're stimulating the temporal lobes using these magnetic fields, I would say that there probably are people who shouldn't use these, like people with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders.
So you could imagine having those machines with some trained therapists?
Yeah, I absolutely could imagine it with trained therapists.
That would be an expensive machine?
Not very expensive, no.
Expensive.
No, you could build it pretty inexpensively. I mean, in every set of earphones that someone has, if you have a set of earbuds, you can open up that earbud and you'll find inside of it a small solenoid. And that is a kind of threat to the existing system that is largely based upon the use of pills and other kinds of chemical activators, which do cost a lot of money.
Yeah, we may find out that you have much less side effect than any other auto-medication, alcohol, cigarettes, or drugs of any kind, and it will be it's something that and probably a much better experience, a deeper. And so this would the God helmet, as it's called, could go in both models. You can generate that experience through the activity of the brain, or you can adjust the antenna and just receive the experience. So it doesn't have to be an hallucination type of experience at all.
That's a very interesting way to put it, and I completely agree. And suppose that's what people are doing all the time when they engage in the types of behaviors that allow people to hallucinate. So we know that there are certain things that will facilitate hallucination: oxygen deprivation, isolation. There's certain kinds of compounds that you can take, fasting, right? Ritualistic behavior like repetitive motions. All of these kinds of facilitators may in fact be tuning the internal antennas in the form of whatever cellular substrates are governing this, whether it's microtubules or other kinds of internal structures. And yes, you could be basically tuning into other kinds of frequencies that exist in the environment. That's not really surprising either, because of course, we know that we have different cones in our eyes that pick up different frequencies of light. If you were to slightly change the protein structures inside of those cones, the rhodopsin molecules, you could slightly shift the types of wavelengths that you would be able to pick up from the environment, and your vision would be entirely different. So, changing internal structures to receive different signals that actually exist at all times in the environment would change the subjective experience associated with those signals.
So in other terms, you would just disturb your receptor, the reception of those frequency, and that's a disturbed reception will create hallucination. So a real the real information that has been disturbed because you don't receive it properly, but it's based on something that may exist somewhere. So that's called a hallucination, a story that has been disturbed enough, but still make a little bit of sense, and you can still see something.
Right. And we know from there's studies from psychiatric populations that demonstrate that geomagnetic field storms caused by solar flares
Right.
Will actually increase the rate of epileptic seizures in hospitals. So you can actually see seizures go up as the geomagnetic field increases in its activity and therefore its flux density. And so there's already grounds to demonstrate that as the external field is changing, the way that it's received by the brain changes as well, because these individuals, these epileptic patients, are not having seizures under one condition of the geomagnetic field, and then suddenly when you change that field, now they're having seizures. And so there's already some basis for this.
Now you're doing just what's your most recent research you're working on?
Well, what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to build three-dimensional brain tissues using biomaterials and human cells that are transformed into neurons. We put them together in a dish, we create three-dimensional bioengineered tissues, and then with them we can simulate all sorts of different diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. We can simulate traumatic brain injuries and so on. But what we can also do is we can use healthy cells, and we can have these miniaturized brains hooked up to robots and virtual simulators to see how they can be trained by basically games and other kind of cognitive tasks. In the past couple of weeks, we've seen a couple papers come out that have shown, for example, that these embodied neural systems can do things like play Pong. Like they can actually play basic games and understand how to achieve certain outcome goals on the basis of what kinds of sensory input you give back to the cells. As long as they're getting feedback from their environments, they do tend to learn on their own.
If you have a minute, can you talk to us about Alzheimer and herpes?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can tell you some of the work that I've collaborated on to look at this link. So there is an epidemiological relationship when you look at just population data. When you look at the people who have herpes simplex virus 1, which is, by the way, found in half of the population. So 50% of people will show this virus.
They say 80 sometimes. They say even sometimes 80% of it, or like an enormous amount.
Yeah, that's right. It's in certain populations it's even higher, but at least half of us have it. And so when you look at these individuals, they're more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease later in life. And so then the question is, well, what's the link? Is this just a completely spurious correlation, or is there an actual mechanistic link? And it turns out that what we did was we showed that if you infect three-dimensional brain tissues made of human cells, human neurons, if you infect them with herpes simplex virus 1, they will start to develop protein plaques, protein aggregates that share all the features and are regulated by the same genes and same biomolecular pathways as Alzheimer's disease. And these can be inhibited using antivirals. And so there is, in fact, some kind of link between the biomarkers that you see in Alzheimer's disease and this virus. Now, the question is, why doesn't everyone who has herpes simplex virus have Alzheimer's disease? And because, of course, they don't. And so the question is, what's actually happening there? Now, the virus needs to actually make its way up to the brain. And we have a lot of protection between wherever the virus is dormant and the brain. One of them is the immune system, but the other is the blood-brain barrier. And both of those become weakened in old age, as well as a function of periods of great stress in people's lives. And so it becomes possible, the longer you're alive, to have these kinds of viruses make their way up to the brain, infect brain cells, and then as a function of that infection, the brain starts to produce these kinds of plaque aggregates. Now, none of this is to suggest that the one sole cause of Alzheimer's disease is herpes simplex virus. In fact, there are several infections that are probably related to Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. But one of the ways that you can get Alzheimer's disease seems to be an infection with this type of virus.
And I remember a study when they said you, at the center of a plaque on those aggregates, you could find the herpes, like as if the plaque was protecting the.
So that kind of blew my mind when we realized this. So the main author on the paper is Dr. Dana Cairns, and when we originally found these plaques had contained within them the herpes simplex virus, the hypothesis was floated that perhaps what's happening is that the brain is actually trying to occlude them or
neutralize them
in some way. Perhaps Alzheimer's disease, or at least one of the main correlates of Alzheimer's disease, is a defense mechanism against an infection. And if we were able to temper that defense mechanism, perhaps we could get rid of the virus, because you don't want your cells being infected by viruses, but you also don't want the products of that infection, which is the beta amyloid aggregates. So yes, if it really just is a defense mechanism, perhaps we just need to change the defense mechanism of these cells, or attack the virus so that the brain doesn't have to do it on its own. So yeah, it may just be a response, like the brain really is trying to get rid of the virus, in the same way that when you get a brain injury, the cells will start to scar, like you get a glial scar, and scarring is part of a healing process. You need it for various reasons to stop the cascade of damage, and yet scars can be epileptogenic foci, like they ultimately hurt you in the end, but you need them in the present moment. So yeah, I think that's fascinating, like the brain's response to the virus being the main generator of Alzheimer's disease. But there's more research that's required to really solidify.
Or maybe we can find, like with scar, like keloid scar, hypertrophic scar, people who respond too much to infection, people can modulate their response and stop it on time. Do you remember what other microorganisms can create aggregates beside herpes, Coxsackie? I mean, do you remember any other infection could create Alzheimer?
Thinking about it off the top of my head, I mean, there's the classic prion disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which generates all sorts of interesting aggregates. But are there any other infections? I know that, for example, when you look at chronic traumatic encephalopathy, just getting hit in the head a lot and having chronic inflammation of the brain, you do also tend to get this kind of these kinds of aggregates that are characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. So it may be less about the virus itself, but more about inflammation, which again is the response to the virus.
Perfect. Fantastic. Yes. Well, it's a very enlightening conversation we had today. Nicolas, thank you so much. Please contact me as soon as you find the origin of consciousness in the universe, from whatever black hole you're going to find it.
I'll be sure to call you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Blessings.
Let's do it again.
Okay, let's do it again. Thank you.